Hello everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to ask for your support. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. Your comments mean the world to us, so don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Now, let's get started with the story. The scene opens with two individuals standing at the palace gate. One is a man, and the other is a woman. A male voice, belonging to Prince Shedhilds, echoes through the air. If it's Hilds, is he the king of the kingdom of Hilds? The question hangs heavy in the air. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't be able to win. You mentioned a desire for something in exchange for your exploits for the Delo Empire. It was quite intriguing, Karzan remarked, turning to Raha with a peculiar smile. The king should address her directly, he suggested. Raha's expression turned cold as she faced the king. Raha del Harsa, a raw voice, deep and unfathomable, resonated in her ears. I want her, your majesty, the prince declared. Raha, the princess, muttered to herself, I always loathe winter. All bad things happen to me during this season. The scene shifts to a bedchamber. He dominates her, his passion intense and unrelenting. The man, dominating the woman, moves with a primal intensity, his body a blur of motion. His words, though few, are filled with a possessive hunger. The woman, caught in his grasp, struggles against his overwhelming force. Her cries are muffled, her tears a silent testament to her helplessness. Her pleas for understanding are met with a cold indifference. The man's sole focus is on satisfying his own desire, regardless of the cost to her. She cries out, demanding to know his true intentions. I want you, and I desire to be within you, he replies, his voice filled with desire. I plan to make you my plaything, to satisfy your lust. He captures her, entering her forcefully, his words a constant barrage. The scene is one of raw passion and domination. The man's actions are forceful and unrelenting, leaving the— Do you remember the time when I was manipulated by you like a doll? He asks, his voice taunting. She freezes in shock. Their lovemaking continues, relentless and passionate, lasting well into the night. The grand hall was a spectacle of opulence, filled with the laughter and chatter of the empire's elite. Yet, a palpable shift occurred as Princess Raha entered. All eyes turned toward her, and the cacophony of voices fell to a hushed murmur, gossip flickering like candle flames in the dim light. Raha stepped forward, her presence commanding. The gown she wore flowed like liquid silver, shimmering with every movement, while her long, dark blue hair cascaded down her back, a striking reflection of her royal lineage. Despite the evening's festivities, a tension hung in the air, thick and foreboding. I congratulate you on your victory, your majesty, she greeted, a smile curving her lips. She directed her gaze at Karzan, her brother, the half-emperor, who stood a few paces away, exuding an unsettling charm. Don't be so formal, Raha. You should call me by my name. You're stiff, he retorted, a playful smirk dancing across his features. Karzan, she replied, her voice lilting with an almost melodic quality. I missed you. His gaze sharpened, and for a moment, the warmth faded from his expression. Yes, Raha, he said, his tone heavy with unspoken emotions. I'm glad you're safe. I went to the temple every day to pray for you. As Karzan leaned closer, his hand reached toward her neck, stopping just above her collarbone. The brief contact sent a thrill of fear and exhilaration coursing through her. Her breath caught momentarily, a fleeting sensation that both thrilled and terrified her. You wore the necklace I gave you, he noted, his fingers brushing the surface of the large diamond pendant that rested against her skin. For a heartbeat, the world around them seemed to still, an electric charge hanging in the air. But just as quickly, he withdrew his hand, breaking the fragile moment. I have brought my lovely twins some new trophies, he announced, his voice adopting a more menacing tone, drawing the attention of the crowd. Raha felt a chill run down her spine as two figures were dragged into the hall. They stumbled across the lavish carpet, their movements jerky and disoriented. Gagged and bruised, their appearances were a grotesque testament to their treatment, their once vibrant hair now stark white, drained of all color and life. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. These are rebellious test subjects created in the Western Kingdom, Karzan declared, his voice cold and unyielding. Last year, I gifted you similar subjects from the Holy Kingdom, but now, his voice trailed off, the implication of his words hanging heavily in the air. Raha's heart raced as she processed the gravity of the situation. The sight of the battered men reminded her of the horrors lurking in her brother's heart. Karzan tightened his grip around her wrist, his fingers like iron shackles binding her to the moment. In exchange for sparing their lives, the old kings have knelt before me. The Del Harsa royal family will also receive their due. Reward, she echoed, the word bitter on her tongue. Yes, Raha, as always, I'll gift them to your bedroom slaves. The cruel smile that adorned his face sent a shiver of revulsion coursing through her. He was her twin, yet the depths of his depravity were unfathomable. Karzan Del Harsa was a force to be reckoned with, a young emperor whose thirst for power knew no bounds. He had carved a path through the kingdoms, leaving destruction in his wake. The nobility of the Delo Empire had come to envy her, the princess adorned with the spoils of her brother's conquest, yet they whispered in dark corners about the corruption that festered within the royal palace. Once, Raha had been the perfect princess, the beloved daughter of the empress. But everything changed the day Karzan ascended as crown prince. The Delo Empire was blessed by its ancestors, and the transition of power had been marked by a startling revelation. Raha, with her innocent blue eyes, had unwittingly usurped Karzan's birthright. The memory of that day was etched in her mind, the shock of the crowd, the horrified expression on her mother's face when she had struck Raha, exclaiming, "What the hell? Why do you have the eyes that Karzan should have?" It was a betrayal she could never forget. From that moment on, Raha had lost everything to her brother. The very essence of her identity was twisted into something grotesque. As they moved deeper into the hall, Raha remembered the events that had led them to this moment. The Delo Empire had been a beacon of power, but with Karzan's ascension, darkness had seeped into its foundations. He had conquered kingdoms in his pursuit of supremacy, reducing entire nations to ruins. The laughter of the nobles around her was tinged with the echoes of their suffering, the bloodshed that paved the way for their celebration. The atmosphere shifted once more as Karzan's voice rang out, cutting through the whispers. You should be honored, Raha. These trophies are a testament to my strength. Raha's heart raced as she considered his words. While the crowd marveled at Karzan's ruthlessness, she felt the weight of his actions pressing down on her like a shroud. The trophies he spoke of were not mere objects, they were lives shattered by ambition and cruelty. 1 year ago, it was early winter. No one could have predicted that the Holy Kingdom, with considerable influence over the entire continent, would be shattered under an atrocious flag. Blood splattered on the beautiful stained glass windows, and dead paladins dangled in front of the statue of God, their heads hanging and swaying. Severed limbs were scattered on the marble floor, and the 11 high priests, who were considered the most supreme in the Holy Kingdom, knelt and trembled. "Ha, Your Majesty the Emperor," and standing before them like a painted conqueror was a young emperor with blue hair. Karzan Del Harsa tilted his chin with an amused expression. "Well, what do I do when the noble high priests are trembling like this in front of me?" He laughed cruelly. "Yes, there must have been a laboratory in the Holy Kingdom that will create the weapon to end the royal family of the Delo Empire. Without even realizing it, only the innocent kingdoms were destroyed." Sarcasm mixed with cruel laughter. Pain seeped heavily into the eyes of the priests. There was nothing wrong with Karzan's words. Indeed, many kingdoms had been trampled under the footsteps of the Delo Empire. But, if Karzan hadn't slaughtered so many kingdoms, there was no way such a laboratory would have been built in secret. That young and beautiful emperor killed a tremendous number of people just to strengthen his military power and tighten his grip on the collars of the nobles in his country. Red blood pooled like a puddle. "Your Majesty." Poof. Clank. Several experimental subjects were dragged and thrown in front of Karzan, who was sitting comfortably. The experimental subjects, with heavy chains attached to their legs and necks, were trembling. Karzan said, raising the chin of one of the experimental subjects thrown on the floor with his foot. "I cannot dare to take the heads of the sacred priests, so instead I will show you how to kill these experimental subjects very brutally. Let's see, shall we?" The oppressive gray eyes gleamed coldly. We could hang them on horses from the temple and drag them to the imperial palace, and cut off their limbs. I'm sure it would be very ragged. After that, I'll throw it straight into the boiling pot and we'll treat the priests to a feast. It wasn't a joke. Karzan was completely serious right now. The priests trembled in fear. The experimental subject who had just been grabbed by Karzan was especially young. He had just come of age. In addition, compared to others, he was definitely raised with dignity. So anyone with a good eye could easily guess. The fact that this test subject was one of the exiled royalty or nobility that Karzan had trampled on. It seems that you have come crawling to me, dreaming of revenge. Your Majesty, please have mercy on me. Eventually, one of the priests crawled on his knees and clung to Karzan's feet. Such was the obvious submission of the priests, who were solitary and holy and would not kneel unless they were poor and sick. All of this will be recorded anew in history. It was then that the young tyrant smiled pitifully. It seems you have given these dogs more affection than I thought. That's because you're weak-minded people who give affection to the livestock. On such a subject, he did not know he had experimented with humans. It was a contradictory doctrine. Of course, it didn't matter. Karzan tossed the boy with a plop. The experimental subject, who was in shambles even before he was brought in, fell straight to the floor. Then what should I do? You're telling me not to kill it. Ah, he had a good idea when he saw the bright red blood on his boots. The iron-blooded emperor did not hide his smile. In any case, only his face was. A young man armed with the unique beauty of the Dello royal family. Even with a sword dripping with fresh blood, Karzan looked like an angel for a moment. Let's do this way, priests. My beautiful twins are here with me. Because I've already made a lot of promises to give her many gifts in this conquest. There are quite a few solid ones too, so we have to sort them out properly and throw them all into her aggression. The priests froze in place. Of course, they would be relieved that it was still better than the sentence of having their bodies shredded alive. In any case, Karzan liked his idea very much. He handed the sword, dripping with blood, to the knight and sat down. It was only a month ago that he was informed of the "Kill the Imperials of Dello" experiment. However, the experiment was to be conducted in the Holy Kingdom, so no matter how much Karzan wanted to, he couldn't just wield his sword arbitrarily. Therefore, he set 3 kingdoms adjacent to the Holy Kingdom on fire one after another. It wasn't too difficult to turn them to ruins, as they were only a few weak and benevolent kingdoms that relied on God to survive. Seeing the priests already shaking with guilt made him feel much better. Karzan said in a more generous voice than usual, "Although this has happened, I will invite all the priests to the imperial palace. You have to see the glorious appearance of your cherished livestock being presented to the princess." The arms of the priests began to tremble little by little. "I'm sure you won't refuse, priests. Shouldn't there be reconciliation? God must not be angry." Of course, Karzan himself did not believe in God at all. There was no awe in him. The beautiful and sacred architecture and carvings and testimonies of the Holy Kingdom remind him of the blue eyes of his twin. Because it was really driving him crazy. And then, suddenly, Karzan straightened his back. "What about you, Raha?" The faces of the Kingsguard, who stood unmoving behind Karzan, were momentarily perplexed. For they all did not know the whereabouts of Raha. "Raha del Harsa, Your Majesty," the knights hurriedly scattered by the silent signal of the nervous captain of the Kingsguard. "No way, you didn't run away from here, did you?" Raha breathed heavily. "I wish I could run away from here." It was a meaningless whisper. She stepped through the broken door and entered. Already the great temple of the Holy Kingdom had been trampled to pieces by military boots, and all the hard doors like this one had long since broken down. Of the hall creaked open, revealing a figure who drew Raha's immediate attention, a man, chained and gagged, his eyes alight with defiance. The sight sent a jolt of urgency through her veins, and she felt an instinctual pull toward him. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for the gag that muffled his voice, tearing it away with desperate determination. The moment their eyes locked, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding forged in the fire of suffering. Don't spit it out. You must swallow it to survive. Please, she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. With her left palm pressed to her lips, she offered him her blood, an act of rebellion and survival. The man's eyes widened in shock, the taste of metal filling his mouth as she pressed her lips against his. It was not a kiss born of love, but of necessity, a lifeline in a world that sought to crush them. As he drank, the urgency of the moment enveloped them both, and she wiped the remnants of blood from his lips with a cloth she had prepared, her hands shaking. Just then, Curzon stormed into the room, his expression darkening at the sight before him. "Raha!" he bellowed, his voice a mixture of concern and anger. The guards flanked him, their faces pale, sensing the tension crackling in the air. "What's the matter?" she replied, feigning innocence, her heart racing beneath her calm exterior. The proximity of her brother ignited a sense of foreboding within her. Curzon's gaze hardened as he surveyed the scene, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, stepping closer, the weight of his presence overwhelming. "I hadn't been in a temple for a long time. It was the first time since I was a little girl, and I knew I would never return." "Oh, yes." Curzon's expression relaxed as he gently brushed a strand of hair from Raha's forehead. "I was about to cut off all the priests' heads because I thought you were gone." He spoke casually, a level of tyranny never before seen in history. However, Raha maintained her smile. "I won't disappear, Curzon." A smile of amusement crossed Curzon's face. "Yes, Raha." Their voices sounded strange, almost eerie. "You can't steal those eyes and disappear," Curzon whispered, raising his hand. "Yes." His fingers traced Raha's lips slowly, lightly pressing down on her chin. Her red lips remained thin, showing no crack in their expressions, even though he could push his fingers into her mouth at any moment. They were twins who looked eerily alike. "I can smell blood. I stepped in a puddle of blood earlier." "I see." Curzon finally lifted his gaze, glancing at the man bound in chains, and whispered in Raha's ear. "Raha, yes, I'll give you all 16 of them, including him, as your slaves." His voice was sweet, trying to mask the roughness of his words. The story of the slaves being dedicated to the princess was well known, but the terrible art engraving on their bodies was a new horror. "Your Majesty, what the hell is that?" Curzon enjoyed the shocked expressions of the priests. "Oh, art can be a little painful. I know how precious my twin is, and I don't want impure thoughts to take root. They must not become dangerous in their pursuit of pleasure." Curzon's eyes gleamed brightly, causing the priests to tremble. The additional priests finally spoke up, seeing the experimental subjects unable to even scream. "Oh, engraving something like that, can they survive?" "Of course, priest. If they're lucky, that is." However, none of the slaves had lived past a week. "So let's drink together as a sign of reconciliation, priests." "Priests. Yes, yes." There was nothing but sheer boredom on Curzon's face, as he watched the prisoners of war twist and bleed to death. It was just common entertainment for him. Raha was used to sleeping with dead bodies. It was the only funeral she could give them, watching them until their last breath. The funeral, held hundreds and thousands of times, was repeated once again. Sometimes, people found solace in watching them die. The night passed slowly as new slaves entered Raha's inner palace. At the same time, in Raha's inner palace, there was nothing special about being an experimental subject for the temple. Everyone except this one is not even in a state to be brought to the bedroom. This one is also going to die soon. Okay. A short reply. Curzon's wizard smiled deeply and bowed his head. No one in the inner court knew that the blue-eyed princess's mood would hit rock bottom on the day she carved her enchantments on the slaves. So, even the wizard kept his tone proper in front of Raha, only on this day. Raha stared at the man lying on the bed. He was washed clean, and even though he was a slave, he belonged to the princess, so he was quite decorative. He still wore a gag, and his eyes were blindfolded. Even handcuffs were still there, making him look like an animal. Now that he had the stigma, he didn't need these anymore. Perhaps Curzon had ordered this on purpose to scare the priests. Raha released the man's handcuffs, took off the blindfold, and threw it on the floor. The man's face was truly beautiful, even in his pale state. But, it's the same. The breath that was gradually disappearing was no different from the other slaves. It was not that different from the usual scene. Raha felt a sense of sadness. All those slaves who died in front of her, with the same complexion, expression, and breathing, slowly drew their last breath. They all had one thing in common. They all breathed their last breaths in hatred and anger towards the Raha in front of them. Raha's trembling hand hovered over the man's cheek. The man couldn't open his eyes, even though there was a shadow. Raha clenched her hands tightly and sat down with her knees folded, resting her cheek on it, lightly stroking the man's hair. She buried her face on her propped-up knees, watching the motionless man. How much time had passed? Raha didn't even budge. On days when slaves entered, she always slumped down like this and fell asleep. There was nothing uncomfortable about it. Like a stone statue, Raha's body, which had been cowering like a dead person, trembled. This was because she could feel a distinct body heat coming from her wrists. As Raha lifted her head, a tinglingly strong grip pulled her wrists tight. It happened in an instant. She was lying on the bed, her vision turned upside down. She was not lying there peacefully. Both of her wrists were held down, and just above her, a man shivering with fever and pain was staring at her. A living man. A slave who didn't die. Really? Raha's eyes went wide. She reflexively tried to sit up quickly, but gave up. She finally opened her mouth. You. But the man's voice was faster than hers. Why did you feed me your blood? It was a tired, somewhat exhausted voice. A subdued voice from a throat that had not been used properly for several days. Raha, who was staring at the man blankly, replied quietly. The blood of the royal family is good for neutralizing the engraving. The man had 2 eyes, too. There was no way he did not see the test subjects who were dragged to the imperial palace die as soon as the brand was engraved. That's right. This princess saved him. Why? What do you want from me? I don't want anything. Nothing. Yes. He smiled slowly. Raha's gaze slowly went downwards. All she could see was the man's tight muscles. I was sick of my slaves always dying in front of me, so I just wanted someone to live. Half of it was a lie, but half of it was serious. That's why I used what I heard from somewhere. Your life is nothing to me. The man stared at Raha. It seemed that he was just looking at her, but she felt threatened. Perhaps it was his intimidating physique that gave off that vibe. Still, she wasn't the least bit intimidated. She only had a painted smile on her face, as if she didn't feel threatened by anything. Rather, she even finally pulled out one of her wrists, which was being held by the man, and raised her hand and swept the man's lips. It was amazing that the slave had a slight complexion. Raha suddenly remembered one thing. She grabbed one hand of the man and put it on her neck. What are you doing? Can you kill me now? He looked at her like she was crazy. Raha's slender fingers wrapped around the back of the man's hand and pressed it, but the man's hand did not exert more than a certain amount of strength. Because the brand engraved on the slaves was designed to protect the princess perfectly. It doesn't work. Useless. Raha stared at the man. The wizard, who engraved the brand on the slaves' chests, was the first wizard of the imperial palace and Karzan's subordinate. He was so desperate to be loyal to Karzan that he could be called an authority. In any case, it's an enchantment that is engraved on the slaves who serve the princess's bedchamber. It was a painful mockery that everything Raha touched died. But today, there was a slave in front of her who did not die. A beautiful man whom her twin put there to do whatever she wanted. Didn't the attendants inform you to listen carefully to your master? A silence fell. The man looked at Raha silently. The man had a strange, overwhelming atmosphere, and it was hard to predict how he would react. That was when Raha slowly blinked. So, what can I do for you? It was a low voice. The man grabbed Raha by the chin without warning. In a flash, her chin was pressed and her mouth naturally opened. This was a behavior that Karzan often did. He would grab Raha's chin, push it down, open her mouth a little, and leave it there, deciding whether to push his fingers in, his tongue in, or otherwise leave it alone. But if there was one thing that was different from that time, it was that this slave in front of her was really kissing her. The man's hand peeled off Raha's shawl. The man's grip was basically strong, and the fragile cloth was torn apart. The cloth slipped, and the man's hand dug in between the open collar. Raha's breathing rasped for a moment. The man hadn't been wearing anything properly to begin with. His hand supported Raha's neck and pulled her in. If it hadn't been for the instinctive fear of a dead body in front of her earlier, she would have held his gaze a little longer on the man's almost naked. Man lifted Raha's head and she could finally get a more decent look at him. He had a sleek, beautiful physique. His broad chest was constricted by thick muscles, and his thick arms, taut even under the thin fabric, bobbed tightly as he moved. His straight, long arms and legs were natural, and the two hands were overwhelming enough to snap Raha's thin neck with one hand. Most importantly, there were many scars all over his body. However, they weren't needle marks that were used in a laboratory. It was more of a sword mark. "Were you a knight?" the man who was staring at Raha replied. "No." With a short reply, the man kissed Raha again. Her breath burned wistfully. Before she knew it, she was panting heavily in her chest. It was always like that. The man buried his face into Raha's chest. A momentary moan escaped her throat. Ah! It was a strange sensation, really unfamiliar. Her body, which was already climaxing and sensitive, crossed the pleasure threshold at a much faster rate than before. Eventually, the overwhelming pressure caused her to lose consciousness. In a fleeting moment, Raha recalled a past punishment from the Empress, standing in the cold until she nearly collapsed. The memory of the Empress's sweet milk contrasted with her fear and hatred. Suddenly, a man appeared and embraced her, rescuing her from the cold winter solitude. The next day, Raha woke before dawn, a habit ingrained in her since she entered the inner palace. The man beside her still slept, his features softened in repose. Memories of their mingling from the previous night danced faintly in her mind. He was an arrogant slave, yet in this moment, with his eyes closed, he seemed almost childlike, innocent enough that anger felt misplaced. As she swung her legs over the side of the bed, a sudden pain shot through her lower back, startling her. The intensity of it made her pause. "Does it really hurt this much?" After a moment's hesitation, she shuffled to the bathroom, her movements slow and deliberate. After that they both went for dining hall. Once seated at the table, she broke the silence. "You're lucky, you know. If I weren't lucky, I'd be dead," he replied, the unexpectedness of his words eliciting a faint smile from her. She reached out, brushing the damp strands of his hair aside. "I suppose you would be, like the others," she said, her voice softening. "Instant death, right? I wasn't there to see it, but..." He fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Raha felt a surge of confidence. It seemed he was not treated as coldly as the other experimental subjects she had witnessed perish before her eyes. "How does it feel to watch them die?" she asked, curiosity edging her tone. There was no malice in her voice, it was genuine inquiry. His brow furrowed slightly as he met her gaze. "Are you trying to provoke me?" "What?" she replied, caught off guard. "You act like you're in a rush to see me angry." She hesitated, taken aback by his insight. Perhaps he was right, she had been testing the limits of his composure. Yet, as he shifted his gaze away, she sensed he had more to say. When he didn't continue, she pressed on. "Won't you get angry?" "I don't think that's something I'd offer you," he said simply. His calm response intrigued her. Many people expressed their anger toward the weak, but he seemed different, detached yet aware. Was it because he was still alive? Perhaps he hadn't yet realized that his anger could be directed at her, a noble princess. As sunlight poured through the high windows, illuminating his silver hair, Raha pondered the weight of their situation. This man, a mere slave, listened to her with an attentiveness she had not expected. She found herself drawn to his blue-gray eyes, a striking mixture that reminded her too much of her brother, Karzan. "Don't raise your head in front of Karzan," she warned, her voice steady. "Understood," he replied without hesitation. Those eyes, so similar to her brother's, could incite Karzan's wrath. She had no doubt he had held back his anger for a long time. After all, it was Karzan's knights who had shattered their lives. Raha understood the hatred directed at her. The powerless often bore the brunt of others' frustrations. "What is your name?" she asked, fixing her gaze on him. He met her eyes without the caution she had anticipated. "They called me 192 in the lab." "Shed," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. It felt like an alias, but it was better than a number. "In public, I'll call you 192. But here, you're Shed." A smile curved her lips, warmth blooming within her. Despite the chaos surrounding them, she felt lighter in his presence. And, she hesitated, the connection between them growing clearer. He reminded her of someone, Karzan, with his soft words and gentle demeanor. But Shed was different, there was an edge to his arrogance that intrigued her. "Just a reminder, speak to no one outside of this room. Use respectful language with me and the Emperor." He nodded, surprising her with his compliance. She chuckled, realizing how often she found herself surprised by him. "You may call me Princess, Master, or whatever you wish," she said playfully, the words dancing in the air. Raha's confinement to the inner palace had become routine, but it felt strange to venture out to the grand banquet hall so soon after her arrival. The familiar voice of her brother broke through her thoughts. "I'm afraid I'm interrupting your fun, Raha." "It's all right, Karzan," she replied, fiddling with the delicate earrings he had given her, feeling the weight of her new life settle around her. He remarked, "You look livelier than usual today. Am I intruding on you and your new bedchamber slave? You must be quite upset, dragged to a banquet after less than 2 days of rest." She replied with a calm smile, "Of course not, brother. Since you do not have a betrothed woman by your side, it's only right that I am present." He smirked. "Ever my thoughtful twin sister." He began to respond, "Well, that's because," but abruptly stopped himself, the words dying in his throat. She watched him closely, her thoughts unspoken but sharp. "I know you like to hear such words. Words that imply, I could take up the mantle of your betrothed." Her attention shifted as she noticed the high priest entering the hall. Excusing herself, she moved to greet him, leaving her brother to brood, his eyes lingering on her retreating figure. As she approached the high priest, she greeted him and those accompanying him with practiced politeness. However, it was evident they were wary of her presence, their unease tangible. With a soft smile, she inquired, "Why are none of you drinking or enjoying yourselves? This is a welcome banquet in your honor, High Priest. I had some of the finest wine in the palace brought out for the occasion." Noticing the tension in the room, she gestured to a maid. "You there, fetch some tea." Turning back to the group, she continued with a warm tone, "Perfect. I actually prefer tea over wine. Would you humor me with your conversation for a while?" The guests exchanged hesitant glances but complied, clearly unsettled by her commanding yet graceful demeanor. The high priest hailed from the Holy Land, Grey, the spiritual pillar of the continent. This neutral, independent region was a beacon of peace. The former empress of the Delo Empire had considered Grey untouchable, and it was a source of great frustration for the current emperor. Upon ascending the throne, the emperor had reconstructed his palace, striving to project an image of divine authority, as if his abode represented the realm of the gods. Yet, beneath this facade, it was evident his efforts were born of vanity. No matter how grand his palace, it paled in comparison to the sacred and untouchable nature of the Holy Land. His inability to rival the high priest's nod at him, a bitter truth he could neither ignore nor accept. Seated across from the high priest, the princess's expression grew thoughtful. Her voice was steady as she stated, "Number 192. He is alive and well." Her words were calm, yet they carried a weight that made the high priest falter. He lowered his gaze, his demeanor subdued. "In fact," she continued, her tone sharp yet measured, "he is so healthy that he could devour me whole." The high priest opened his mouth, as if to respond, but simply murmured, "I see," and fell silent, his composure betraying signs of inner turmoil. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she thought, "His days are filled with guilt and worry. His expression confirms my suspicions. Number 192 is not just a simple test subject to be used and discarded." Tilting her head slightly, she advised, "Though I am unaware of what precisely has occurred, I suggest you learn to control your expressions better in the future. The high priest stiffened before bowing his head slightly. Pardon me, he said quietly. Her gaze didn't waver as she pressed on, her voice laced with curiosity and veiled accusation. I have been thinking, why did it have to be the Holy Land? Why would those who serve the gods attempt to create a killing machine? Perhaps, she paused, her eyes piercing. Perhaps you intended for the test subject to reach the Empire in the first place. She leaned forward, her words deliberate and cutting. No matter how much Karzan rampages, the Holy Land is the one place he cannot completely crush. And if your experiments have any connection to these blue eyes of mine, then close physical contact might indeed be the key to achieving your goals, whatever they may be. Her voice softened, though her tone remained firm. If, by any chance, I am correct, you must fix the attitude you display. Karzan's eyes are everywhere. The high priest visibly trembled as his teacup slipped from his hand, crashing onto the floor. She smiled faintly, her voice laced with mock concern. Oh dear, you must be careful, high priest. From now on, you need to be extra careful, especially if you mean to protect your precious test subject. After the tense exchange, the princess excused herself and retired to her chambers. As she walked through the dimly lit hallways, she thought, I am so tired. But I am glad he let me leave before midnight. Dismissing the higher servants, she entered her room, only to find Shane standing there. Her brows furrowed as she asked, What happened to your hair? Shane shrugged. It was bothering me, so I cut it off. She nodded absent-mindedly before heading for a bath. As she soaked, her thoughts lingered on his appearance. His hairstyle has changed, but he looks so different. I wonder, did he use a dagger to cut it? Later, as she emerged, she teased, This isn't your first time attending to someone's parties, is it? You seem quite familiar with the routine. Shane smiled faintly. I've done it a few times before. Her tone turned playful. And what kind of bedchambers were you attending? Ignoring her teasing, he asked, Why do you always wear such thin clothes? Her demeanor shifted, her voice turning serious. These are my armor for battle. He frowned. And the heavy earrings. Her expression darkened. I think of them as shackles. Their conversation turned quieter as Shane suddenly lifted his head. I spoke with the high priest at the banquet today. Did you see them using tea during the experiments? She replied curtly, Not really. With a shrug, she continued, Well, I suppose they're very important and busy people. Karzan seemed anxious for their safe return, but with this blizzard blowing, they might not make it back properly. Her tone grew somber. I hate winter. Every year without fail, something bad always happens to me during this season. Shane's expression softened as a memory surfaced. He recalled a young girl, small and frightened, being struck by her mother. Her maiden had been killed that winter as well. As the gloom settled around her, Shane moved closer, his voice low and comforting. I do not know what you have been through, but you do not need to be held back by the past. He continued, his tone resolute. A nightmare is just that, a nightmare. It cannot consume your reality. Their eyes met, and slowly, the distance between them diminished. The cold winter night outside seemed to vanish as the warmth between them grew, and the night stretched on into quiet intimacy. The next morning, Raha awoke early, her mind surprisingly clear despite the tension of the previous evening. Dressing herself with care, she chose a gown that was elegant yet understated, exuding a quiet power. Her hair was styled delicately, and the hint of color on her lips added a touch of vibrance to her serene demeanor. Her butler entered the room, bowing slightly before speaking with thinly veiled sarcasm. Ah, Your Highness, you're up early. One can only assume you had a most pleasant night with your bedchamber slave. I must admit, I find myself somewhat envious of him. Raha met his gaze with a calm yet cutting stare, not dignifying his comment with a response. The butler, ever observant, straightened and gestured to an attendant who entered carrying an ornate box. The butler spoke smoothly. His Majesty has sent this, Your Highness. It is for tonight's banquet. The attendant carefully opened the box, revealing a stunning piece of jewelry. It was a necklace of exquisite craftsmanship, adorned with rare jewels that sparkled brilliantly in the morning light. Even Raha's maid, accustomed to luxury, let out a small gasp of surprise. Raha stepped forward, her expression unreadable as she examined the necklace. Its value was unmistakable, a piece that could rival the crown jewels themselves. "I shall return the necklace I received last time," she said after a moment, her tone firm. The butler smiled faintly, though his eyes glinted with amusement. "Ah, but that was a gift from His Majesty, Your Highness. Would you not rather keep it?" She turned her sharp gaze to him. "Hadestward," she called him by name, her voice carrying a note of finality. "That was not a gift, it was a loan. Such a precious item belongs to the future empress, not me." The butler hesitated, clearly unwilling to argue further. "Very well, Your Highness. I shall ensure it is returned." As the butler and attendant left, her maid approached cautiously. "Your Highness, we must go to your dressing room now, or you'll be late for the banquet preparations." Raha nodded but couldn't suppress the grimace that flickered across her face. The head steward, she thought, is the Empress's dog in every sense of the word. The sight of him makes my stomach churn, especially his gaze, it always teeters on the edge of propriety. As Raha was preparing in her dressing room, the door suddenly burst open with no announcement. She turned sharply, startled, and was met with the imposing figure of the Emperor himself. His golden eyes narrowed as he spoke, his tone curt. "You are taking longer than usual." Raha wasn't fully dressed, and the intrusion caught her off guard. Flustered, she stammered, I'm sorry, Your Majesty. Allow me to escort you to the reception room while I—" He cut her off with a dismissive wave. "No need. I'll wait here." "Continue." Her heart sank. She was powerless to refuse him, and his piercing gaze made it clear he had no intention of leaving. "As you wish," she said softly, resigning herself to his demand. "At least there are no visible marks on my body," she thought grimly. "Perhaps it's a blessing in disguise." Her maids froze, horrified at the situation. How could she undress in front of him? They wondered silently, exchanging nervous glances. Raha, however, remained composed, though her thoughts raced. "He seems upset. Did someone provoke him again? For him to barge in like this, it must be a sensitive issue." As her maids worked to loosen her corset, she let out a quiet sigh of relief. The Emperor's sharp ears caught the sound immediately. "What was that sound just now?" he demanded, his gaze darkening as he took a step closer. Raha replied smoothly, her voice steady. "I simply felt suffocated for a moment, Your Majesty." His eyes narrowed as he moved closer, his presence oppressive. "I see. I didn't know such sounds could escape your lips when things are too tight." Before she could respond, he pulled her into an embrace from behind, his touch sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "The banquet is about to begin," he murmured, his tone low and intimate. "We are late. Surely, you don't expect me to go out looking like this." She turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. His demeanor shifted again, like an actor slipping into a new role. His voice was now calm but edged with irritation. "Of course not," he said, stepping back slightly. "As always, your role is to appear by my side. Speaking of appearances, are you planning to approach the High Priest again today?" His question was laced with thinly veiled anger. Raha hesitated before answering. "What do you mean, Your Majesty?" He smirked, though his eyes were cold. "The two of you seemed to have a heart-to-heart yesterday." Raha forced a smile, her tone light and dismissive. "We didn't talk about much. I simply wanted to understand why he would commit such terrible acts. I can't wrap my head around it. How dare he even think about bringing our empire down?" The Emperor's gaze bore into hers. "And did the High Priest give you an answer?" Raha shook her head, feigning innocence. "No, Your Majesty." He turned as white as a sheet and didn't utter a word. The Emperor's hand moved to the necklace he had gifted her, his fingers brushing against it possessively. "You must be cautious around the High Priest," he said softly. "I can't brand my sigil on their hearts, after all. But with you," his voice dropped to a whisper. "You, Raha, I feel differently about you." He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her lips before she could respond. Her body stiffened, but she forced herself to nod. "Yes, Your Majesty, I understand. During the banquet, Raha moved gracefully among the guests, her every step exuding poise. One guest approached her with a warm smile. Your Highness, you look radiant as always. Another chimed in, their tone laced with hidden meaning. How do you shine so brightly at every banquet? Oh, by the way, I heard His Majesty will be hosting a banquet soon in search of a potential match. Surely, with you so close to him, you might have some insight. Raha smiled politely, her expression giving nothing away. Indeed, another added, though His Majesty's half-siblings were either sold off or slaughtered, he cherishes you above all. Another murmured, how lucky you are to be His Majesty's favorite. It seems even he, a mighty emperor, is just a man in the face of your beauty. Raha maintained her composed smile, though she understood the hidden barbs beneath their words. As she mingled, her gaze shifted, noticing the high priest. He was composed tonight, his expression carefully guarded. He's doing a good job of keeping his emotions in check, she thought. I was worried he'd give everything away to Karzan without even realizing it. Her musings were interrupted as her eyes caught sight of a familiar figure across the room, and her heart skipped a beat. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on new content. Share your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep imagining and keep creating.